one of the finest authors in the English language. His books are not just a delight to read, but they're also a challenge, and his essays explore subtle truths with gentle wit. But what is he himself like? That's what I hope to reveal as I introduce you today to Amitav Ghosh. Welcome to the program, Amitav.
Thank you, Karan. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Now, your friends say that if there's one thing that Amitav always wanted to do, it was to write. Are they correct?
Yes, absolutely. It was the one thing, since I was about 7 or 8, I would say, I somehow knew that, I would always make my living by writing. Writing what? I didn't know. At that point it could have been soap operas or anything. But yes, I certainly knew that.
In your essay, The Ghosts of Mrs. Gandhi, you write of Naipaul, "It was he who first made it possible for me to think of myself as a writer working in English." How exactly did he influence you?
He had a really profound influence, and the more I look back on my past and the more I look back on, how I thought about writing and so on, he was a very, very important influence. In the 70s, when I was sort of coming of age and, in school and college and so on, there weren't then, the plethora of Indian books that you have now. I mean, today you could fill an entire bookshelf with books written by Indians in English, excellent books. But in those days, there were just a very few names. And for me, Naipaul, when I read him, immediately, it sparked an incredibly powerful engagement. Which is not to say that I agree with Naipaul, which I don't. I can't imagine that I agree with even half of anything he says. But there was an integrity to his project. There was an integrity to the sorts of questions he was asking that really sort of shook me up and made me think that this is another way of writing. Here is someone who is an Indian who's talking about these things, with whom I have some sort of a connection, and who's made a way for himself in the world.
So in a sense, he gave you the confidence as well as the courage to believe that there was a place for an Indian voice in English literature.
It's exactly that. It's exactly that, really. I mean, because, in those days, as an Indian writing in English, you felt really like a fish out of water a lot of the time. It was very hard to know where you could function. And, Naipaul really made it possible to see, that this could be something you could do with, with seriousness.
Now, I'm told that when you came to write your first book, The Circle of Reason, you did it in a hot, sweaty Barsati in defense colony. In a sense, was that the Indian equivalent of an artist's garret in Montmartre?
As I was sitting there sweating in this Barsati in defense colony, I used to think that someday someone's going to ask me that. And it's true, it was. I mean, it was like I used to call it my garret. It was, literally 6 feet by 6 feet. It was right on top, and you know what it's like in Delhi summers. I mean, it was like an oven. And I used to sit there in my lungi, just typing away, hour after hour. And it was an extraordinary experience. I mean, I look back upon it with, great affection, really.
But was it in fact difficult? You're going to romanticize it today, but at the time, did it require a lot of dedication, a lot of determination to continue?
It did. It was incredibly difficult. Apart from everything else, at that point, you're in your sort of mid to late 20s. All your friends have jobs. They're earning money. And you're sitting there, in a tiny little room, which was actually a servant's quarters. It wasn't a Barsati even.
And on a salary, I'm told, of just 600 rupees a month.
That was later. In fact, earlier it was 300. So, with almost no money, and you're just struggling away with this thing, and you don't even know if anyone's going to be interested in it.
How close did you come to actually giving it all up and saying, maybe I should do something else?
I remember I finished the first draft of my first book, The Circle of Reason. And it took me a year to write it. I was living in Trivandrum. I finished it. Then I started rereading it. And by the time I'd read 10 pages, I knew that it was awful. So I took all this work, 300 pages, and I just threw it away.
And began all over again?
I began all over again. And, and then I said to myself, I said, look, another year maybe, but if something doesn't come out of it, you've got to sort of rethink this,
So there was a point of desperation that you'd reached?
Absolute desperation, absolute desperation. And I think really that kind of desperation, that sense of, that, when you're writing a book, that your life does depend on it. If you don't finish this book, either this book will kill you or you'll be able to write the book. That's what puts life into a book. And that's what happens to me to this day. I mean, in the last phases of a book, I feel I'm like in a mortal struggle. I mean,
It continues with everything you've written.
absolutely everything. I mean, it's the essays are a lot easier, but certainly with the fiction, bringing a book to its end. I mean, it's really like it's mortal combat.
But today, when you are one of the best established authors writing in the English language, when you look back on those days and then see how far you've come, do you have a small glow of satisfaction, a sense of fulfillment?
I have a sense of wonderment. I mean, I look back on it
When
and
you genuinely can't believe I've got so far.
yes, absolutely. Because, to write is such a small thing. I mean, it's not like making a movie or something where you have hundreds of people, millions of dollars and so on, or, rupees and all that. Writing is one person alone in a small room with a piece of paper. And that doesn't change, you know. And to think that that then goes out in the world and, sends out these ripples. In a sense, it's something completely miraculous. And to this day, I feel amazed by my life. I feel amazed by what happens to me.
You sort of think it's a dream that could just burst one day and you'll discover that it was all not really true.
That's the nightmare I do sometimes have, yes.
Okay, let's go back to the very beginning. You didn't just grow up in India, you grew up in countries like Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Iran. What sort of childhood did you have?
It was very unsettled in a way, I mean, Bangladesh was very ironic, because my family are historically from Bangladesh. So, we were going back there, but we were really, from the place. We even spoke the dialect of Dhaka, and yet we were foreigners, So it was a very strange feeling. But I think in the long run, it was perhaps Sri Lanka that really left the sort of profoundest mark on me. And, I went to school there, in a wonderful school called Royal College. I started going there when I was 9. And Sri Lanka is the only part of the Indian subcontinent which actually uses an indigenous English demotic, a completely indigenized English. And it was a language the kind of English I got into speaking, And nowadays, sometimes when I read, novels written by Sri Lankans in this language,
it takes you all the way back.
It takes me so powerfully back. Recently, I've been reading this writer called Carl Mueller, who's a Sri Lankan burgher. And I just found myself so moved and so haunted, and this whole language came just flooding back to me.
You're talking about reading. I gather, in fact, you began reading virtually when you entered your teens. This was serious stuff that you began doing from then onwards.
Oh, I started reading very seriously long before my teens. I was always a very avid reader. And I think that's partly to do with, my childhood, that we were always being moved. So, you sort of grew to distrust your outside world a little bit.
You created your own world with the books you read.
That's right.
There's a wonderful story that you read Shalokhov's Quiet Flows the Don when you were 12. Is it true?
Yes, my uncle gave it to me. And, he was a sort of old-fashioned Calcutta intellectual, and he said, yes, you have to read Sholokhov. And I sort of opened it and went plowing all the way through. And, since then it's extraordinary. I've met writers in so many places. Miathan Tint, the great Burmese writer, Pramodya Anantatua in Indonesia, and asked them, which was the great book that started you off? And they all say, And Quiet Flows the Don.
Your friends say that it was really at university in Delhi that you blossomed. They say you were forever arguing with people and you did it with enormous gusto and passion.
I did, yes. I look back on my life in university as a long series of arguments with a lot of people. I think if you believe in things, or if ideas are important to you, or if what you're doing is important to you, you feel passionately committed to it. And if someone disagrees with you, you want to persuade them that they're wrong, or that you are right, or that you have reasons for doing what you're doing, and you have reasons for believing what you believe. And I'm like that to this day, I would say.
They also say that he used to hate losing an argument.
I think that's true as well.
And then they laugh and they say there's completely another side to him also. He loves drinking and he used to love dancing.
When I started in the sort of my career as a writer, there really was a sense of, to be a writer, you had to be in some way a bohemian, And I certainly got into that kind of bohemian life, such as was available to us, with great gusto. Yes, I certainly did enjoy that. I think I would say really, I take an interest in life and, in the sort of exuberance of life, and that sustains me.
You've done a lot of different things, and you seem to have done them almost deliberately. A few years after this, when you were at Oxford doing your DPhil in social anthropology, you spent several months in an Egyptian fellahin village called La Taifa. What was that like?
It was actually more like a year, and it was extraordinary because, suddenly there I am, I was 21 or 22. I go off to this tiny village where there was no electricity. It was, we were in mud huts with straw and, overrun with fleas. And I was sharing my room with, some 8 or 9 chickens, which were also growing up there. So, I mean, it was just a complete shock. And suddenly I'm in a place where nobody speaks anything but Arabic. And I'd started learning Arabic, but, my Arabic was still rather halting. So, it was really like if you'd been taken off somewhere and been put into outer space for a while, because, for the first time I realized what it meant to be in a completely silent world where you don't understand a word that anyone is saying to you. At night, I remember, I had a little transistor radio, and I used to sort of go through it, and every time I came to a familiar language, I would just listen, and it was like having a bath, the words would flow over me, it was extraordinary that
So you
way.
lived your life with the radio as a sort of companion rather than anyone else?
No, soon I became completely fluent in Arabic, and I made a lot of friends, and, in many ways it was completely wonderful. It was a magical experience.
In your
many ways.
essays, you write of an engaging character who became a friend of yours, and you seem to have called him Kamiz the rat. And he was always bemused by the fact that you came from a society where they buried their dead.
He was. You see, they'd never seen an Indian before, and they only had some sort of stereotypical notions. So, with Khamis, for example, I remember once we were out walking, and we were walking past a cow, and he said, "Stop, stop." And he went off, made me stand there, he went off and got a mat and put it down. And I said, "What do you want me to do?" He said, "Well, aren't you going to lie down and worship the cow?" No, really, I have never done that.
Today, when you look back on those years training and then doing your DPhil as a social anthropologist, how important are they to the career that you eventually pursued as a writer?
They've been very important. For me, being in Egypt was really my equivalent of being in a writer's school. Because, what I did was I kept copious notes in a diary, and it really put me through the whole process of observation, which is so much a part of the novelist's craft. And I was very lucky, while I was living there, I read Marquez, the 100 Years of Solitude. And it was extraordinary because this village was like 100 years of solitude, And I read Boswell, The Life of Johnson, which really, if you read The Life of Johnson, it's really a book about conversations. And that really helped me very much because, I began to make very detailed notes of my conversations, and that eventually became a book in its own right.
Amitav, let's take a break. I want to come back in part 2 and talk a little bit about the work you've done and perhaps a little bit more about you. We'll be back in a moment's time. See you then. Welcome back. My guest is one of India's most highly regarded writers, Amitav Ghosh. Amitav, let's talk about your work. After reading A Glass Palace and At Large in Burma, I get the feeling you have a special relationship with that country. Am I wrong?
You're not wrong at all. I have a very sort of powerful relationship with Burma. And it started curiously, because my family, like many Bengali families, and especially, say, families from Bengal, Tamil Nadu, and so on, did have a sort of historic connection with Burma. And I had relatives who went off to settle there in the late 19th century. Especially, I had one uncle, who became a refugee after the war, and he was living in Calcutta. And he told me these wonderful, wonderful stories about Burma. So I grew up in the way that, say, some North Indians grew up with stories about, the Northwest frontier or something. I grew up with stories of Burma in my head,
But it's not just historical Burma that you've been close to. You've also spent time, as you mentioned in your essays, with insurgents.
Yes.
Now, it sounds like a romantic thing to do, but in fact, was it all of that?
At the time, it just seemed very dangerous. But in some sense, it is romantic. Though, romantic is perhaps a bad word to use for people whose lives are really just completely devastated. And I'm talking really now about, the young idealists, the students who had to leave Burma in 1988, and who since then have really been just sort of eking out a living along the Burma border. And these are really, young men and women of incredible idealism and dedication, whose lives have just been devastated, by what's happened in Burma. So it was very, very painful, to just to even be with them because their lives are so difficult.
You sympathize very closely with their cause. In fact, I get the clear impression from your writing that not only do you admire Aung San Suu Kyi, but she's one of your chosen special heroes.
I think that's probably true. I really admire Aung San Suu Kyi very, very much. And at bottom, it's really because I think she has something which no other political leader of our times has, which is that she understands the virtue of patience. Patience is the most sort of elusive virtue in the world, and she understands what it is, that things take time. And for this alone, I just respect her hugely. Because, I've spent time in places like Cambodia and so on, where, the UN sort of marches in and decides we're going to reinvent everything overnight. And it doesn't work like that, I mean, life is long, it takes time, things take time. And she understands that, and I really admire her for that.
In your book, The Glass Palace, Dinu, one of the more engaging characters, says of Aung San Suu Kyi, she is the only one who seems to understand what the place of politics is, that it cannot be allowed to cannibalize all of life, all of existence. Is that a view the author shares with his character?
That came completely straight from the heart. Yes. Yes, I feel, and the more I've been around the world, and, I've done a fair amount of sort of even political reporting in different places, I feel that in some way, especially for me as a writer, but for every human being who's trying to lead, a self-conscious life, a self-aware life, it's become very important that, we recognize how important politics is and the importance of it, but also that we learn to keep a domain which is sovereign for our inner space, for our inner lives. I feel that we've reached a point where really our inner lives are being invaded by politics in such a sort of dangerous way, really, that we have to fight this battle. And I think that is one of the wonderful things about Aung San Suu Kyi, that, she recognizes this. She recognizes that, for the sake of politics, she's not going to do everything possible. She's not going to call out a march that's going to result in hundreds of thousands of people dead. And for that, again, I do her honor.
In a sense, that's a criticism you could make of contemporary India, couldn't you? That we seem to attach politics to everything. We politicize everything, and perhaps we overemphasize the importance of politics itself.
I certainly am of that view. I think that there's a sort of over-politicization of our society where politics is in everything, whether it be sport or film or everything. And of course, one of the reasons for that is simply because until, say, the 90s, the government and the political sphere actually had control of everything. But I think one of the really encouraging things that's happened in the last 10 or 15 years is that, other sectors of life have evolved and emerged and have become increasingly strong and powerful. Say the whole sort of voluntary group phenomenon, the NGOs, the community-based organizations, as well as the private sector economy. So no longer is it only politics that runs our society. There are other areas which
life
are
is recovering the lost ground from politics.
That's exactly right, and I think that's one of the great hopeful signs in India to me.
Amitav, let's talk a little about yourself. Your friends say that he has always been intensely ambitious, very conscious of, in a sense, a destiny that he was born to. Are you a driven personality?
I think it's hard for anyone to answer that about themselves. I mean, I would certainly say that, I've always been ambitious in my work. And that's what really matters to me. I mean, when I think of a novel, when I think of a project that I'm going to work on, it doesn't interest me unless it's taking on a lot, unless it's taking on a lot intellectually, a lot in narrative terms, a lot in terms of history. So my projects are enormously ambitious. I think that's certainly true. But, the sorts of ambitions that people have in the world, of sort of, big house or whatever, those are not my ambitions at all.
Materialist ambitions are not something that you share with everyone else.
No, certainly those are not my ambitions at all.
Your friends also point to certain paradoxes. They say that he makes friends very easily, but he fights with them just as easily too.
I think any sentient being who goes through the world, anyone who has friends must understand that,
you will fight.
You will fight, and, it's always like that in any close relationship. And I think, when you fight with friends, it's because you care about your friends. But, I think I've been very lucky in many, many ways, and one of the ways in which I've been very lucky is that I've found a sort of community of people here in Delhi, in India, in Calcutta, in many places, who are interested in very similar things. And a lot of the work that we've done, and many of the people I know have done incredibly interesting creative work. A lot of the things that we've done has come out of, you know, a collective engagement with each other. And often there are disagreements, and I think that's a good thing.
And disagreements, in a sense, are the essence of a relationship just as much as agreement.
I couldn't agree more.
In 1990, you got married to Deborah Baker. How did you meet her?
It was completely, it was just chance. I happened to be, you know, on a visiting professorship in Virginia in the United States. And she was, she works in publishing, and she was visiting there. And we met, and, you know.
Love at first sight?
Well, you know, let me just say that a year and a half later we were married.
They say of you that he's a much calmer, more confident person, that in a sense the spirit has been slightly rested after meeting Deborah. Has she had a good influence on you?
I think so, absolutely. I mean, certainly I would say that, you know, since then, my wife and, you know, really my children, I would say, have really been such a sort of area of fulfillment for me. And more than that, you know, I think one thing I've recognized as a writer is that my involvement with my family, with my children, gives me strength to write. It gives me something to write about, you know, it gives me material. Now when I write books, I find more and more children in them, you know. And, you know, when you have children at a certain point, everything you do is for them, really.
You've achieved an enormous amount very quickly, and yet you're only 46. How long do you think writing will continue to fulfill you? Or do you think you're going to look for other challenges?
You know, it really frightens me when people ask me that, because it's like, you know, my work is behind me. And I always think that I'm just getting started, you know. I have so many books ahead of me. I mean, I really just feel that, you know, my life as a writer is just beginning. Because, you know, unlike other people who may write a book and then do something else or some other thing, I've only ever wanted to write. That's all I know how to do. That's all that interests me. That's all I want to do. So if I weren't writing, I wouldn't be alive.
Not politics at any point in time, because you write about politics, you've been a journalist briefly earlier. Would politics never interest you?
One thing I can say absolutely categorically is that I would never be in politics.
And yet there would always be a political content to what you say and do, because so much of your comment is involved with the moral side of politics.
See, I think there's often a sort of, you know, a sort of misconception. As a writer, I think we do comment on collective ethics, and that's kind of different from politics in some sense. And I think ethics interest me, collective ethics, the ethical life of a people. Of course, that's of interest to me. But politics in the sense of, you know, elections and winning elections and that kind of thing, it doesn't interest me in the least, no.
Amitav Ghosh, a pleasure getting to know you.
Wonderful to meet you, Karan.
Thank you.
Thank you.